taxing and spending powers to manage the behavior of the economy. Responsibility of the Department of Finance. Its purpose is to ensure a healthy Canadian economy by developing policies of sound economic management and providing expert advice to the government. Minister of Finance proposes an annual budget in Parliament each spring. Contains estimates of government's revenues and expenditures. Stabilization policies. Stabilization policy refers to government policy designed to lessen the ups and downs of the business cycle, particularly inflation and unemployment. It can be either expansionary or contractionary. Expansionary policy attempts to reduce unemployment and stimulate output. Contractionary policy attempts to minimize inflation by reducing demand, which can have the side effect of reducing output. So expansionary policy grows the economy, while contractionary policy shrinks the economy. Effective stabilization policy minimizes the severity of the peaks and troughs in the business cycle. So that's why the government intervenes, because it minimizes the severity of recessions and high inflation times. That's why the government steps in to get us out of a recession or make prices more affordable. So the problem with peaks are that prices are unaffordable. So the government has to step in, raise interest rates, and do contractionary monetary and fiscal policy to bring down prices. While for a trough or contraction, the government has to step in to bring jobs back and bring the economy back to growing. Differences between actual output and the long run trend of potential output are therefore smaller, thus reducing recessionary and inflationary gaps. So with stabilization policy, the recessions are less severe and the inflation situations are less severe as well. That's why the government steps in to make these things less severe. Stabilization policy can take the form of either fiscal policy or monetary policy. Fiscal policy uses taxes and government purchases. Expansionary fiscal policy involves more government purchases and or lower taxes to shift aggregate demand rightward. Contractionary fiscal policy involves fewer government purchases and or increased taxes to shift aggregate demand leftward. Monetary policy uses interest rates and the money supply. So a rise in government purchases or a cut in taxes increases aggregate demand, shifting the aggregate demand curve from 80 naught to 81. This causes a rise in the equilibrium price level and output rises to its potential level from point A to point B. As a result, the economy's $20 billion recessionary gap is eliminated. A fall in government purchases or rise in taxes decreases aggregate demand, shifting the aggregate demand curve to the left from 80 naught to 81. This causes a fall in the equilibrium price level and output falls to its potential level from point D to point C. As a result, the economy's inflationary gap is eliminated. So the government has a contractionary policy through reducing government spending and increasing taxes to bring down prices. And that'll make things more affordable. So the government can reduce their spending and increase taxes to make things more affordable. And that can work, but the problem is there would be a lot of protests because of increased taxes and reduced government spending. There'll be a lot of protesting. That's why they usually do this with the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada usually just raises interest rates or lowers the money supply because they're not elected, so they don't have to face a lot of the scrutiny that elected officials face. So it's easier for them to do it, to do contractionary policy, but with government officials, they're the fiscal policy makers, they're elected, so they get a lot of public scrutiny. So anything that they do will get protests potentially. So raising taxes or reducing government spending would be potentially lead to protests for them. So in each of the following cases, state what types of fiscal policy, if any, should be applied. Real output is less than potential level. So what will be your answer for A? So we would want expansionary. Because we would want real output to become potential. So if real output is less than potential level, we would want expansionary policy to make real output equal to potential level. Yeah. But good try, Abby. So then what would be the policy if unemployment is below its natural rate? So in this case, so unemployment is below its natural rate, which is actually a good thing because we have lower unemployment than the natural rate, the average, basically, like the lowest rate of unemployment. Our unemployment is very low in this case. So if unemployment is very low, like let's say it's 3%, that's very low. Let's say the natural rate is about 4%. If unemployment is less than the natural rate, that means that the economy is doing very well. Not a lot of people are unemployed, so that could also mean that prices are very high. Usually, when the economy is doing very well, prices are very high. Things are very unaffordable when the economy is doing very well. So they may have to do contractionary fiscal policy to bring down prices. So they'd have to use contractionary monetary or fiscal policy to bring down prices. They don't usually, like I said before, they don't usually use contractionary fiscal policy because of the public scrutiny that elected officials have. So they leave it up to the monetary policy to do contractionary policy. So they leave it up to the Bank of Canada to do contractionary monetary policy to bring down prices. Because, like I said, the elected officials they'll face protests if they do contractionary fiscal policy. So what about real output equals its potential level and unemployment is at its natural rate? What should we do? Yeah, neither. So call it good job, Abby, as well. Neither. You don't have to do anything. So the economy is right at right where it should be. So you don't have to do anything. Well done. So yeah, real output is less than potential level because real output is less than potential. And expansionary fiscal policy is called for, which means government purchases should be increased or taxes decreased. Unemployment is below its natural rate. Since unemployment is below its natural rate, a contractionary fiscal policy should be used if there are signs of rising inflation. This means government purchases should be decreased and or taxes increased. Real output equals potential level and unemployment is at its natural rate. While with the economy already at its potential output and the corresponding natural rate of unemployment, there is no need for fiscal policy. So discretionary fiscal policy is intentional government intervention in the economy, must be passed through the House of Commons, so that's convening government. Automatic stabilizers are built-in measures such as taxes and transfer payments, e.g. employment insurance and welfare to lessen the effects of the business cycle. So they kick in when there's a recession and they help people while they're out of work, which can help the economy automatically. A contracting economy decreases net tax revenues, which increases government spending and therefore business and personal incomes. An expanding economy increases net tax revenues, which decreases government spending and therefore business and personal incomes. So the multiplier effect is the magnified impact of a one-time spending change in aggregate demand. An initial spending change produces income, and part of this new income becomes new spending. This process is repeated with each spending round, some smaller than the last. Think of it as respending impact. So I think of it as a return on investment. So if you had a multiplier of let's say 1.2, if the multiplier is 1.2, multiplier equals 1.2, every dollar invested produces $1.2 of value. So basically 20 cents profit. So that's how I look at it. It's a good way to show what the return on investment would be. So in this case, it would be 20%. So calculating the multiplier for all your investments would be very valuable. And a good measure of the multiplier for stocks is return on equity. So yeah, so the return on equity is a good measure of the multiplier for stocks. So you could potentially compute a multiplier with the return on equity for stocks. And that's a good measure of if it's a good investment or not. So the multiplier can be used to determine effective investments. Post this in the chat here. But yeah, it's an important concept, and yeah, it can help with determining how much profit you're going to make on something. Each new spending round is determined by the marginal propensity to consume, MPC, which is the percentage of increase in the income that is spent on domestic consumption. Each new spending round is also determined by the marginal propensity to withdraw, which is the percentage of the increase in income that is withdrawn from current domestic circulation, i.e. income tax, foreign input savings. Marginal propensity to consume, marginal propensity to withdraw always sum up to 100% of the increase in income. The spending multiplier is the value by which the initial spending change is multiplied to give the total shift in the aggregate demand curve equals 1 divided by marginal propensity to withdraw. The actual change in equilibrium real output is less than the change in aggregate demand found using the spending multiplier because if prices usually increase when there's a large increase in demand, some of that extra spending is absorbed by higher prices rather than the extra output of goods and services. Marginal propensity to consume is defined as a change in consumption of domestic products as a proportion of the change in income. Marginal propensity to consume equals change in consumption on domestic items divided by change in income. Marginal propensity to withdraw is defined as a change in total withdrawals as a proportion of the change in income. So marginal propensity to withdraw equals change in total withdrawals divided by change in income. So marginal propensity to consume plus marginal propensity to withdraw equals 1. Multiplier equals 1 divided by marginal propensity to withdraw. So active learning. Suppose income rises by $1,000 and that a consumer spends $800 in domestic products, but uses the rest in savings, taxes, and imports. What is the marginal propensity to consume in this case? Yes, 0.8, correct. So yeah, 0.8. And then well done. Well done, Kala here. And then what is the MPW in this case? It's 0.2. So it'd just be 1 minus 0.8. And then what would be the spending multiplier here? Oh, wow. So what would be the spending multiplier? Five, correct, Nicole. Yeah. So we do 1 divided by the MPW. So 1 divided by 0.2 equals 5. Well done. So for in this case, every dollar invested would produce $5 of value. Yeah. So it's a very good investment here. So the yeah, so the multiplier is very high. So active learning. If an economy is initially in equilibrium and injections rise by 1 million, then by how much will withdrawals have to rise to bring in injections and withdrawals back in balance? Hmm. So withdrawals will have to rise by the same amount of 1 million. So the injections and withdrawals are then again equal. So yeah, in that case, you'd have to send in the same amount. So if the economy's MPW is 0.67, then by how much will incomes and output have to rise in order for total withdrawals to equal the initial injection of 1 million? So to do this one, incomes and output must rise by 1.5 million. So to get this, you would have to do 1 million divided by the 0.67, and then you'll get 1.5 million. Yeah, so that's how you would do that. You would have to do 1 million divided, so 1 divided by 0.67 to get 1.5, and then it would just be 1.5 million. So that's how you would do that there. Yeah. So on the left, a $1,000 rise in government purchases gradually pushes up real output by $2,000, assuming an MPC of 50%. Each round of spending adds successfully smaller amounts, as indicated by the dark rectangles. On the right, each successive round of spending involves a greater amount of total withdrawals until new withdrawals equal the initial rise in spending. So spending affected output alone with spending multiplier of 1.5, a $20 billion rise in government purchases would push output by 30 billion from point A to point B. So to do that, you just do the 20 billion times 1.5 and then get 30 billion. So yeah. However, since the price level is also affected, the shift from aggregate demand 0 to aggregate demand 1 causes equilibrium to move to C. Because the slope of the aggregate supply curve, the closer the economy is to potential, the greater will the impact of the change in aggregate demand on the price level of real output. Fiscal policy has two main benefits. It can be focused on particular regions or groups that need assistance most. It has a relatively direct impact on spending. Fiscal policy has three main drawbacks. It is subject to delays, recognition lag, decision lag, impact lag. It is politically visible. It is closely related to public debt, the amount owed by the federal government. A government is running a balanced budget when its expenditures and revenue are equal. Spending equals taxes. Budget surplus when its revenues exceed its expenditures. Budget deficits when its expenditures exceed its revenues. So ideally, we want a balanced budget or budget surplus, but it's very difficult to get into those areas there because we just have so many expenses and we don't have enough revenue coming in. The government can do this because of borrowing. They can borrow a lot easier than we can. That's why they can run budget deficits where their spending is higher than their income. They can run it because they can borrow and they can also print money. But with us, we can't do that. We can't borrow as easily as the government and we can't print money. So it's very hard for us to run budget deficits in our personal households and businesses as well. We need to run balanced budgets or budget surpluses. So in order to stay in business or stay not bankrupt, because we don't have the option of raising unlimited money or printing money. So the government really has a different situation than us in the business world. They have a lot more flexibility when it comes to spending. They can they don't have they don't have to worry as much about debt than we do. So that's one of the reasons why they can have deficits and take on debt like they do, because they don't have to worry about paying it off as soon as we do. When a government has a budget deficit, its debt increases by the same amount. Budget surplus, its debt decreases by the same amount. In the past, the federal government tended to run budget deficits because of past borrowing. The federal government pays a large public debt interest charges. So a lot of the public debt, the interest charges are very high. It's one of the highest expenses by the government of Canada is interest on the debt. So that money is spent on interest rather than government programs, which becomes a problem. What you could be instead of paying debt, you could pay off other programs and spend money on areas that are needed. But because of the debt that the Canadian government has, that's not an option. We can't spend that money on other things, so that becomes an issue. There are three main approaches that can guide government fiscal policy: annually balanced budgets, cyclically balanced budgets, allows deficits during recessions if accumulated debt is paid off during subsequent expansions, functional finance, budgets designed to stabilize the present economy, irrespective of the surplus or deficit created in the long term. There has been a move from functional finance towards cyclically balanced budgets. Total government deficits were highest during the early 1980s and 1990s. The 1980s deficits were largely discretionary, while the 1990s deficits were related to automatic stabilizers. So the discretionary deficits, that's related to the government wants to spend more during a period or reduce taxes during a period. So it's their choice. Discretionary is their choice. While automatic stabilizers, that's related to employment insurance taking effect because of people losing their jobs and welfare taking effect because people are losing their jobs. So it's automatic. They don't have any choice over the matter because employment insurance is everyone's insured with employment insurance when they're working. And if they lose their job, they can get employment insurance benefits. It's automatic if they lose their jobs. Budget surpluses in the late 1990s and early 2000s were due to automatic stabilizers, low interest rates, and discretionary government spending cuts. So the government in the late 1990s and early 2000s, they had a lot of government budget surpluses where their income was higher than expenses, so they were able to pay down a lot of the debt. So they did this through a lot of spending cuts, which, like I said, spending cuts by the government, there's a lot of public scrutiny because there's a lot of protests that happen, and the government tends not to do that very often because they don't want to upset the public. But they did it regardless in that era, and that led to more budget surpluses, and they were able to pay down a lot of the debt. Key automatic stabilizers are tax revenue, employment insurance, welfare. So when there's a recession, tax revenue will go down. So people are paying less in taxes because their income is less. During a recession, their income is probably going to be less because of the recession. The economy is doing very badly, so their income is likely going to be less. That means they pay less in taxes. So that's a way for them to. So they're paying less in tax expenses. So that can help them because there's less of a tax payment, so they don't have to pay as much in taxes. So that can be beneficial for that person. Employment insurance kicks in, people are out of work, they get employment insurance benefits. Welfare kicks in when people are out of work, so they get welfare benefits that can help them during recession. So, like we see here, these are the deficits from 1980 to about 1997. Canada was in deficit for all those years. And then around 1997 to about 2007, so about a 10-year period, the government of Canada was in surplus. And then the recession of 2008 came in, and from about 2007, 8 to 2012 ish, there was a lot of deficits in Canada. So, yeah. The combined budget balances for the federal, provincial, and territorial governments are shown in percentage of Canada's nominal GDP. Recessions in the early 1980s and early 1990s each caused an increase in combined budget deficits. During the long economic expansion of the 1990s, these deficits gradually declined and turned to combined surplus, only to return to deficit in the aftermath of the 2008-2009 recession. So this is another graph that shows the same result from before, but it's in but instead it's in millions of dollars rather than percent of nominal GDP. But it's basically the same result here. So we had about 10 years of surpluses, which was very beneficial to pay down the debt. But ever since 2008 and to present, we've been in deficit, except for the exception of 2014, 15. There was surplus, small surplus. So Canada's net national debt, this was updated for 2015 here. It was about 612 billion, it's 2015, but now it's over $1 trillion. It doubled during the pandemic because of stimulus for the pandemic. There's a lot of government spending and tax cuts during the pandemic, and that brought the debt over $1 trillion. So Canada may face potentially a debt crisis if these spending levels continue. So like likely to offset this problem, they need to generate more revenue through taxes. If the Canadian economy can grow a lot more over the next few years, that means the Canadian government can more taxes from that growth, and that can pay down the debt. So likely the only solution to this is if the economy grows more to pay off this debt. So the US gross debt to GDP is higher than Canada. The US is about $30 trillion in debt, while Canada has about 1.2 trillion roughly. So Canada's debt to GDP is a lot lower than the US. We still have an issue because we don't have as much power as the US does in terms of our debt. The US has a lot more flexibility because they have the strongest currency in the world. So what they do with that is they can take out tens of trillions of dollars in debt, and they can just print money from the Federal Reserve and use that to pay off a lot of the expenses that they have. So that's a big benefit. Their strong currency. That's the reason why they can take on that much debt. Canada has a strong currency, but it's not nearly as strong as the US. That's why we couldn't get away with having tens of trillions of dollars of debt because we just don't have this strong enough currency. We can't just print money and pay our expenses off as well as the US does. So the US has a lot more flexibility when it comes to that, and they can print a lot of money to pay off expenses, while we can only do it a certain amount because we don't have as much power in terms of the strength of our currency. So we can only do it to an extent, not to the extent of the US. So Canadian US government net debt to GDP, as you can see, Canada's is a lot lower than the United States. And like I said, there's a reason for that because we don't have a strong enough currency compared to the US to get away with taking on massive levels of debt. So debate over public debt. Those who support using public debt say public debt provides benefits by reducing the cost of unemployment. About 80% of federal debt is held by Canadians or owed to ourselves. So when they say owed to ourselves, that means that the government took a loan out from another government agency. So potentially the government of Canada took out a loan from the Bank of Canada. So that's part of it. So technically, if the Bank of Canada prints money, the government of Canada has to borrow from the Bank of Canada for that money. But technically they're the same, they're under the same umbrella, and it's technically owed to themselves in that case because they're not really separate from each other. So yeah. When debt is used to create productive assets, it's not necessarily a problem. So like mortgage debt is not necessarily a problem because everyone needs a mortgage for the most part when they buy a house. car debt, like buying a car, getting a car loan, that's good debt. So debt to buy a place of residence, a car, those types of things, that's good debt. So if you're using it for productive asset, that's good debt, that's fine. But using debt to buy things that are not necessary, that are not needed, that becomes a problem. So borrowing, the government borrowing to do things that are not productive assets, that becomes a problem. Also, households, businesses, if they borrow to not create productive assets, it becomes a problem. So it's best just to borrow for productive assets like houses or cars. There have been times in the past when public debt as percent of GDP was higher than now. So we want it to go down. We don't want it to go up. When it goes up, that becomes a problem because we don't want our public debt to grow faster than a GDP. That becomes a problem because we're likely spending our borrowed money on things that don't matter. So we need to make sure that the um, public debt as percent of GDP doesn't increase. We want it to stay stable. We don't want it to increase because it'll become we'll be spending more on like we'll be borrowing more than we're growing at. Those against using public debt say public debt charges rose until recently. Provincial and territorial debts need to be taken into account as well. There are limits to how much taxes can be raised to pay public debt charges. There are potential future burdens associated with the crowding out effect and the amount of Canadian government debt held by foreigners. Printing money to pay off debt could cause inflation. So, active learning. The government has an outstanding debt of 100 billion. If in a given year the government spends 10 billion and brings in 15 billion in taxes, then what is the government's budget deficit or surplus and what happens to its debt? So obviously it's 95 billion. So with expenditures of 10 billion and tax revenues of 15 billion, there's this budget surplus of 5 billion, and the government's debt falls to 95 billion. So well done, 95 billion. It would be a surplus. So surplus is when taxes are greater than the spending. So here there would be a surplus of 5 billion because there would be 5 billion more in taxes brought in than spending. So yeah, good job on the debt figure, Abby. And then if instead the government's expenditures are 12.5 billion and its tax revenues are 10 billion, then what's the government's budget deficit or surplus and what happens instead? So Nicole says $2.5 billion deficit and debt increases. And Abby says 102.5 billion in the deficit. So if the expenditures are 12.5 billion and tax revenues are 10 billion, there's a budget deficit of 2.5 billion. The government debt therefore rises to 102.5 billion. So well done, Abby and Nicole here. So active learning. A federal government's budget surplus associated with Nicole says C. So it would be tax revenues larger than government spending and is used to combat inflation. So it's going to be used to combat inflation because raising taxes and reducing government spending, that would bring down prices. So that would be contractionary monetary policy. So raising taxes, reducing government spending would be contractionary fiscal policy, and that would lead to reducing inflation. But like I said, the government can't really do that in a lot of cases because of protests. So they leave it up to the Bank of Canada with monetary policy to raise interest rates and lower the money supply. So consider the economic statistics in the chart below. What is the main economic problem shown by these statistics in 2019? So it would be inflation here. So inflation is rising. That would be the problem here. Prices are getting too unaffordable. Unemployment wouldn't be a problem because lower unemployment is a good thing. That means that less people are unemployed. But yeah, prices are getting too high. So inflation is becoming a large problem. So yeah, as you can see, inflation is rising. And describe the appropriate fiscal policy for the federal government's Department of Finance to implement under the conditions described above. Yeah, contractionary, Abby. That's great. Yeah, contractionary. So raising taxes, reducing government spending. And that would be good to reduce inflation. Decrease government spending and or increase taxes, slow down the economy, prevent inflation from spiraling out of control. So briefly explain how a budget deficit arises and how it can be funded. So yeah, how does a budget deficit arise and how can it be funded? So expenditure, obviously, says expenditure is greater than tax revenue borrowing from the Bank of Canada. Excellent. Nicole, the government spends more money than it generates. It can be funded by borrowing from the central bank or printing money. Yes, excellent. Rise when spending exceeds tax revenue, funding, borrowing capital markets, just like corporations borrow from the central bank. Most countries did this in 2009, print money. Same result, government borrows for free and money supply increases. So yeah, borrowing from the central bank and printing money, it's the same thing. The central bank prints money, you borrow it. Contrast government debt with budget deficit or surplus. So what's the difference between government debt and budget deficit or surplus?
A budget deficit or a surplus is like annual, and then government debt is aggregate. Is that the answer?
Yes, correct. Exactly. So, well done, Nicole. So yeah, the deficit is annual and the debt is when you add them all up. Aggregate. Excellent. Well done. So government debt is the total amount the government has borrowed over time. Budget deficit or surplus, how much has been borrowed or paid back in one particular year. So surplus is when your income is greater than expense and you can pay back some debt. What are some practical difficulties of discretionary fiscal policy?
Maybe one would be like uh, public opinion or like protests, like popularity, basically.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, so protests, it's very hard to cut spending and raise taxes, is very difficult. Then Abby says higher interest rates, less consumption. Yes, so that's another issue. Yeah, well done, Nicole and Abby. So expansionary fiscal policy can crowd out business and consumer borrowers and raise interest rates, which tends to reduce the expansionary impact of the policy. So if you raise government spending, reduce taxes, that can also raise interest rates because the when the economy is growing, that could put pressure on interest rates and raise them, which can then crowd out. That means that what you just did really has no effect because even though you raised government spending, let's say, interest rates rise as well, and that led to a reduction in investment. So that could crowd out, as they say. So it just cancels everything out. There are long and variable time lags in enacting fiscal policy and waiting for it to have an effect, so it may not have an effect immediately. The impact of temporary fiscal policy is smaller than the impact of permanent fiscal policy. It may be hard to persuade politicians the merits of countercyclical fiscal policy, especially when it requires surplus. So that means it's very difficult to raise taxes and reduce government